She was rejected 13 times at the auction, until a single father with 7 kids said, "I'll take her." The auctioneers used to set up in the yard behind the feed store under a canvas stretched between 2 wagon wheels. It was practical shade and a flat stretch of ground where people could move around and see what they were looking at. They sold livestock out of that yard all spring, mules mostly, some goats, a pair of draft horses in April that drew men in from 3 counties. I wasn't there for any of that. I was there on a Tuesday in late May because Earl Gibbs, who ran the auction and also, when the county needed it, facilitated the arrival and placement of correspondence brides, had sent a writer out to my land the week before with a note. The note said there would be a woman available on the 21st if I was interested. $19 would cover my name going on the consideration list. I did not go because I was lonely, though I was. I did not go because I had decided it was time, though maybe it was. I went because Rosalie had been in the ground for 4 years and the youngest was still in diapers, and I had a 12-year-old trying to do the cooking and a 14-year-old trying to do the things I didn't have time to do. And I had watched that 14-year-old, my son Aaron, come in from a full day of fence work and sit down at the table and fall asleep before the food was in front of him. 12 years old, 14 years old. I had 7 children who deserved better than what I was giving them, and I was man enough to admit it. So I went. The yard had maybe 30 men in it when I arrived, more than I expected. I took a position near the back where I could see the platform without being in the middle of the crowd, and I waited. Earl came out and said a few words I didn't pay much attention to, something about the process, something about expectations. Then he brought her out. She was taller than I thought a woman in that situation would be. That's the thing I noticed first. She came up the steps onto the platform without looking at her feet, and she stood there in a gray dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone out of it, and she looked at the crowd without flinching. Dark hair pinned up. A jaw like she decided something years ago and hadn't gone back on it since. Earl said her name was Marin. He said she'd come from Illinois. He said she was experienced with household work and was capable and had good health. He started the bidding at $8. Nobody bid. He dropped it to $6. Still nothing. A man near the front said something I couldn't hear and a few men laughed. Earl told them to settle down and raised the price back to $7 and tried again. I watched her face while he was talking. She didn't change. She was standing on that platform in a gray dress in front of 30 men who were choosing not to want her, and she looked like she had been through this before and knew it for what it was and was not going to let it take anything from her that she still had. That jaw, the set of it. Earl said she'd been on the circuit for a while. He said it in a way meant to be explanatory rather than an indictment, but I saw her close her eyes for just a half-second when he said it. 1 half-second, and then she was back. He tried 7 more times over the course of an hour. Men bid once or twice to keep things moving, then stepped back. Some of them walked away. The sun moved and the shade off the canvas shifted, and Marin stood there through all of it. 13 times, I counted. When Earl looked like he was running out of road, I walked up to the front. I said I'd take her at whatever the last standing bid was, which was $4, and nobody offered more, and that was that. She didn't say much on the ride back. I hadn't expected her to. The wagon seat was narrow, and we were close without meaning to be, and she kept her hands in her lap and watched the country go by. After a while, she asked how far. I said about 2 hours. She nodded. I said I had 7 children, and she said she knew that it had been in the notice Earl sent to Illinois. She said it like she didn't mind, which surprised me, and I told her so. She said she'd figured a man with 7 children who was still standing was probably the right kind of man. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. The land opened up past the tree line, and you could see the ranch from about a mile out, the house, the barn, the garden that my daughter Cora had been keeping since she was 10 years old, and that was now, at 12, a real garden, producing real food because Cora was that kind of person. I pointed it out when we got close enough to see it clearly. Marin leaned forward a little and looked. She said it was a good piece of ground. I said it was the best ground I'd ever seen, and I meant it. Every acre of it. Even the rocky part on the north end that never gave me anything easy. When we came up the drive, the children were all outside, because Aaron had spotted the wagon and organized everyone. 7 of them in a line in front of the porch, oldest to youngest, which was Aaron's military way of doing things. He'd gotten it from me and I'd gotten it from my own father, and it was the kind of thing you don't notice until you see it from the outside. Marin saw it. She said quietly that they'd been waiting. I said yes. She got down from the wagon before I could help her, stepped down on her own and straightened her dress and walked over to the line of children like she'd done it 100 times. She stopped in front of Aaron first. She said, "I know you've been doing a man's job for a while. I'm not here to take that from you. I'm here so you don't have to do it alone." Aaron was 14 and not inclined to show feeling. He looked at her for a long moment and then he nodded. That was all, but I knew my son and I knew what that nod cost him and I knew what it meant. She went down the line. She learned every name. She crouched down for the youngest, my daughter, me, who was 2 and didn't know what to make of any of it, and she let me look at her face and touch her hair, and she didn't rush her. I stood by the wagon and watched this woman, who had been standing on a platform 4 hours ago while men walked away from her, move through my children like she'd been looking for them. I want to say it was easy after that. It wasn't. Nothing about it was easy. The first month was the hardest. Not because Marin was difficult, she wasn't, or not in the ways I'd been prepared for. But because we were 2 strangers living in a house with 7 children, and a set of rules nobody had written down. And every day there were a dozen small negotiations that had to happen without the language for them. The kitchen was hers. I understood that within the first week without it being said. She reorganized it the 3rd morning. I came in before dawn to find her moving things, working by lamplight, and I stood in the doorway and she glanced over and said she hoped I didn't mind. I said I didn't. She put things where they made sense to her, and from then on that kitchen ran better than it had run since Rosalie died, and I kept out of her way in there. But there were other things. The 2nd week she came to me after supper and said she needed to talk about the school situation. The nearest schoolhouse was 7 miles, which in spring mud was more like 20, and she'd found out that the older children hadn't been going regular since the previous fall. I told her that was right, that I needed them on the land. She didn't argue with me. She said she could teach them herself mornings if I'd give her 2 hours a day before the work started. She said she'd taught Sunday school in Illinois and could handle reading and figures through what they'd need. I thought about it. I said yes. She taught them every morning after that. Cora turned out to have a gift for figures that nobody had known about because nobody had given her the materials for it. Aaron, who I'd written off as practical-minded to a fault, started reading on his own in the evenings. She did this. Marin did this. In 2 hours every morning before the rest of the day swallowed everything. I started watching her without meaning to. Not in a way I could have explained to anyone. I just watched. The way you watch something that is working the way it's supposed to work, and you don't want to look away because you've forgotten what that looks like. The end of June, she found the leak in the root cellar before I did. She'd been down there organizing the preserves, and she came up and told me exactly where it was and how she'd figured it from the water stain pattern on the south wall. I went down and looked, and she was right. I fixed it that afternoon. She didn't make anything of it, didn't say I should have caught it earlier. Didn't say anything except thank you when I told her it was done. I thought about that for several days afterward. Thank you. Like I'd done her a favor. Like the root cellar was hers to worry about too, and I was helping with something that belonged to both of us. I don't know exactly when I understood that that was what was happening, that it was both of ours, all of it. The root cellar and the kitchen and the children and the land. But I know when I stopped pretending I hadn't understood it, and that came later in October. We'd had a hard September. Lost 2 head of cattle to a fence break, which cost me money I didn't have spare, and there was a man named Durbin in town who held a note on a piece of my equipment and had been making noises about calling it in. I went to town 3 times that month trying to get Durbin to extend the terms, and 3 times he put me off without giving me a straight answer, which is the particular kind of man who enjoys having you at his mercy and sees no reason to end that enjoyment quickly. I came home the 3rd time in a foul mood and said nothing at supper and sent the children to bed early and sat at the table with a cup of coffee that went cold. Marin did the dishes. When she was done, she sat down across from me. She said, "Is it Durbin?" I said yes. She said, "How much?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had money put aside. Not much. She'd saved it from what she'd earned taking in sewing in Illinois before the arrangement with Earl. She said it was enough to cover the note and leave a little over. I looked at her. I said I wasn't going to take her money. She said she knew I wasn't. She said she wasn't offering it as charity. She said she was offering it because it was her land too, and she wasn't going to watch Durbin take anything off it if there was something she could do. Her land too. She said it the way you say something you've known for a long time and are only now finding the words for. Flat and certain, not a question. I didn't say anything for a while. The lamp on the table was burning low, and it made everything in the room a little softer than it was in daylight. And I looked at this woman who had been sitting at my table for 5 months, and somewhere in those 5 months had become something I didn't have a word for but didn't want to lose. I said, Marin, why did you get on that circuit in the first place? She thought about it. She said her husband had died. She said she'd been alone for 2 years and the farm had gone under and she was 41 years old with no people left close enough to help her, and the circuit was the practical thing. I said she was 41. She said yes. She said, did that matter? I said no. It didn't, it truly didn't. I was 53 and my back hurt in the mornings, and I had gray in my beard and 7 children who had spent 4 years watching their father keep things running by sheer stubbornness, while everything good in the house slowly went quiet. I was not a young man, and I was not a rich man, and I was not anything Durbin or men like him would have looked at twice. But she was looking at me, right then across the table in the low lamplight, and it wasn't a look of gratitude for the roof or the food or the fact that I'd been the one to raise my hand when no one else would. It was something else. It was the look of a woman who had been watching and had come to a conclusion and was not afraid to let you see it. I said, we don't have to stay the way we are. She said, I know. I said, I'd like us to be married, really married. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Not a gentle hand, a hand that had worked as much as mine had and knew it and wasn't apologizing for it. She left it there. She said she'd like that too. We got properly married in November in the parlor with the children there and Pastor Gales from town. It was a short ceremony. Aaron stood up with me. Cora stood up with Marin. Me sat in the middle of the floor and played with a button she'd found somewhere and wasn't interested in the proceedings at all, which made everyone laugh, including Marin, and that was the first time I heard her laugh all the way, unguarded, without anything held back. I will not forget that sound. Durbin called in the note 2 days later. We paid him in full, me and Marin together, and I watched him count the money twice because men like that can't believe the ground is solid when someone doesn't owe them anything. He handed back the paperwork with a face like he'd bitten into something he didn't like, and I walked out of his office into a cold November morning with Marin beside me. She took my arm on the boardwalk, not because she needed to, she just took it. We stood there for a moment on the street, the town going about its business around us, the sky the color of pewter and the first smell of snow in the air. I was 53 years old and I had 7 children and ground worth working, and a woman at my side who had chosen this, chosen me, chosen the land, chosen all of it, in full knowledge of what it was and what it wasn't. I have thought about those 13 refusals since, the 13 times men looked at her and turned away. I have thought about it and I have never once felt lucky, not in the way people mean when they say that. Lucky implies something random, something unearned. What I felt, standing on that boardwalk with her arm through mine, was more like rightness, like something that had been out of alignment for years had finally come level. She looked up at me, her face in the cold. She said, ready to go home. I said yes. And we went. That winter was one of the hardest we had. January brought a freeze that cracked 2 fence posts and killed the standing water in the north tank, and we lost a week of work to ice, and then another week to the mud when it thawed. Aaron came down sick in February and was in bed for 10 days, and that fell on all of us. March was late starting, the usual things. But here is what I remember about that winter. I remember Marin at the stove at 5 in the morning, a lamp on the table and the house still dark, making something hot before anyone else was up. I remember her sitting with Aaron when he had the fever, not fussing over him, just present, reading to him from the book on the shelf, because reading to someone lets them know they're not alone without making them feel like a burden. I remember her finding my youngest son Thomas's boot stuck behind the woodbox and bringing it to him without comment, and him saying thank you in that solemn way he had, as if a rescued boot was a serious matter, and her receiving it the same way. I remember her standing in the doorway of the barn one evening after we'd managed to fix a broken wheel on the buckboard in about half the time it should have taken, because she held the thing steady while I worked and didn't let it shift. She was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, cold, watching me hang the lantern back on the nail. And she said, "You know, when I got on that train in Illinois, I had no idea what I was riding toward." I said no. She said no. She said she'd thought it would be something she could endure. Something manageable. I asked her if it was. She looked at me for a long moment in the lamplight. She said no, it's something else entirely. She said it simply, without theater, the way you say a thing that's true and doesn't need any dressing. I hung the lantern. I crossed the barn to the doorway where she was standing. I put my arm around her shoulders and she leaned in, not because she couldn't stand on her own, but because standing together was better than standing apart, and we both knew it by then without having to say so. The cold outside, the warm smell of hay and horses, 7 children in a lit house across the yard. That is what I have to say about that winter. There is a thing that happens to a man when the world has decided he is used up. When he is too old or too hard or too worn down, when his children are more burden than blessing in the town's arithmetic, when his land is paid for but his prospects are called thin by men who have never made anything with their hands. You start to believe it, not all at once. Slowly, the way water gets into wood. You start to believe the accounting that other people are doing on you. Marin stopped that. Not by telling me I was wrong, not by arguing with the arithmetic. She just went on acting as if the accounting didn't exist. She went on treating the land like it was worth caring for, treating the children like they were worth educating, treating me like my judgment was worth asking for and my work was worth standing beside. You don't know what that does until someone does it for you. I'm not a man who talks much about what goes on inside him. I wasn't raised that way and it doesn't come natural. But I am telling this the way it happened because I think there might be men who are where I was, not broken, not done, just convinced by the accumulation of hard years and other people's opinions that the best of their life is behind them. It's not. At least mine wasn't. 53 years old with 7 children and a note on my equipment, and a woman got off a wagon in my yard and started teaching my children to read and fixed my root cellar and paid off a debt with her own savings and stood on a boardwalk in November in the cold and took my arm because she wanted to. That is what happened to me. The land is still there. The children are mostly grown now. Aaron has his own place up the valley. Cora is teaching school, real school, because Marin taught her until she had more than Marin knew how to give her. And then Marin wrote letters until she found someone in town who could take it further. The younger ones are still with us. Mi is 9 and has her mother's jaw and her own opinion about everything, which I expect will give some man considerable trouble in about 10 years, and which I find, in the meantime, entirely delightful. Marin is sitting by the window as I tell you this, reading. She reads every evening, always has something going. I don't know what this one is, I've been meaning to ask. She has her reading glasses on, the ones she got from the traveling lens man 2 summers ago, and she keeps pushing them up her nose because they slide. After a while, she'll look up and ask if I want coffee, and I'll say yes, and she'll go make it, and she'll bring it back and set it down next to me, and sometimes she'll put her hand on my shoulder for a moment before she goes back to her chair. Just a moment, not a big thing. It's not a little thing either. I raised my hand at an auction 21 years ago and took a woman home that nobody else wanted. And every day since then, I have understood something that I could not have told you before I understood it. A man doesn't know what he is until a good woman sees him clearly and decides to stay. She's still here. That's the whole of it.